Thank you, and thank you, Greg. I must say I was worried about that fourth P, but came out okay. Okay, here's the question. What makes us go, awe? What makes you go, awe? I mean, when was the last time that you saw something that left you without words to capture the thing that you were seeing? I'm serious. When was the last time you went, awe? I raise this question for a reason, and it relates to an event that took place in our lives this summer while we were traveling through Israel. Now, the first thing you need to know is that we weren't on the beach or at any resort area for that matter. In other words, this wasn't an awe moment that you might typically be hit with via the media these days, involving people who aren't wearing adequate clothing or being a tad brazen, In fact, it was quite the opposite. We were underground at the time, beneath the hills of Jerusalem, exploring an historical site that had only recently been opened up, and that was gave us insight into an earlier period of time in the history of Israel and how the people lived, which means that we were looking at all kinds of amazing things, very old manuscripts, very old homes, very old everything. I mean, it was extraordinary, as was the entire trip. But at one point, people did something that they didn't do any time else with anything else we visited. And it was what I mentioned a few minutes ago. They went, awe. And do you know what it was they were seeing? It was a cat. That's right, a cat. A very normal, very cute little mother cat with two wee kittens scurrying about the cave, trying to stay away from us, I'm guessing. And when people saw them, they absolutely stopped and they said, look, and then, oh. And it went on forever. And I did it too. Of course, not quite so loudly since I grew up on a farm. Farmers are inclined to keep their mouths shut in such circumstances. But not entirely sure why. But anyway, I was feeling it. We were all feeling it, regardless of what came out of our mouths. And it was kind of dear. It was also kind of funny. And in a few minutes, we were all laughing at the fact that we were cooing over these little cats, when all around us, for the entire trip, in fact, we had been seeing some of the most amazing things in the history of the human race, which is true. I mean, it was an amazing, amazing trip. We were at the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus taught and walked on water. We went down to the Dead Sea and saw not only the lowest place on earth, but the remains of Masada and Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And of course, we were in Jerusalem and Nazareth and saw the Bible come alive, from David to Mary to Jesus. I mean, we went inside the tomb that may very well have been the tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea, in which the body of Christ was laid, very briefly. In short, we were at the place that historians have called the navel of human history, where so much began that has influenced not only religious history, but the story of the human condition from Africa to Asia to Europe to everywhere. I mean, it's beyond words. Even now, as I'm trying to describe it, I'm having trouble trying to figure out what to say or how to say it. But we heard words, of course, lots of them, every day, from experts, from people who were living there today, and from ourselves as we tried to capture, at least in part, what it was we were seeing. When we used words, in other words, all the time, except this one moment, when we saw a mother cat and her two kittens, and then we were without words, and we said, awe. And the question I want to raise this morning is why? What happened at that moment, and how could it happen at such a place, at such a time? Our first instinct when hearing a story like that, at least if you're anything like me, is to think that we were just being stupid. Tourists, from America doing one more ridiculous thing, which we were, in a way. That's why we laughed at ourselves the minute it happened, right? People at a historical site awing at cats are stupid, wouldn't you say? Well, yes and no. Stupid, yes, in that we were diverted from so much else that seems so much more important. But stupid not when you think of how amazing it was to see a little cat being where it shouldn't have been, protecting its little kittens, and dealing with these big animals, that would be us, who were invading its space. Yes, it's stupid if you don't know anything about animals, but ask a biologist, or a zoologist for that matter, and they will tell you there's nothing stupid about it. It's interesting and quite amazing and definitely worth paying attention to. So stupid? No. In fact, I would say upon reflection, it's absolutely right. It was an amazing moment. And the really stupid thing when you reflect on it is why we don't do it all the time. Why do we go through life and see one extraordinary thing after another in the fields around us, in the sky above us, and in the rooms in which we live, and hardly even notice? You are living with some of the most amazing creatures on earth, after all. They're called human beings, made in the image of God. So why don't you say awe every morning when you encounter such a creature, in your room, or walking over the lane, or wherever? Well, it would be embarrassing. I know that. You might even get slapped on the head if you said awe too often, or with too much bravado. But honestly, that's no excuse. You can keep your awes to yourself, for one thing. The Lord can hear them, regardless of their volume. But you need to hear them as well. My complaint here isn't that we're not making fools of ourselves saying awe at every opportunity. My complaint, my question actually, is why aren't we even saying awe in our hearts? Why aren't we full of amazement as we see the fullness of God's creation every day? Well, we're fools, turns out. At least if I'm reading the Bible correctly, we're fools. Let me reread a portion of that Psalm 92 that we read earlier in a slightly different translation. It is good to give thanks to the Lord, to sing praises to the Most High. It is good to proclaim your unfailing love in the morning, your faithfulness in the evening. You thrill me, Lord, with all you have done for me. I sing for joy because of what you have done. Oh, Lord, what great miracles you do. And how deep are your thoughts? Only an ignorant person would not know this. Only a fool would not understand. Pretty good, huh? And pretty powerful, actually. And not one bit of mincing words in this case. We see all the time the evidence of God's handiwork all around us. We see it very directly in what we pray for and how the Lord answers our prayers. But we see it every day as well, in the sunrise on Easter morning or any other morning, in the art of those who apply themselves to canvas, in the play of those practicing soccer on the quad, in countless things which we encounter daily from the time we open our eyes to the moment we fall asleep. We see one miracle after another, but don't go, which makes us awful, according to the Bible, or aweless might be a better way of saying it. And here's the worst part. I'm the number one offender on this thing. The one I know best, who does it all the time. Hate to admit it right here in chapel of all things, but it's true. Not so much when it comes to a stunning sunset. I usually pay attention to those. When something like that happens, I see it. But the rest of the time, when I let so much else get in the way. The other night, Judy and I went out to eat at a restaurant somewhere between here and Boston. Won't tell you where, to protect the innocent. But we hadn't been there for a while, and we had a coupon that was going to cover most of the cost. It was a good deal, in other words. So we jumped in our car and decided to take advantage of it. And at first, when we finally arrived, everything seemed to go great. Got a nice seat out on the deck. We're handed menus that were loaded with great opportunities. And I was in a good mood thinking of what was in store for us. But then everything fell apart. In the first place, turns out Judy's water glass had a crack in it. And before we knew it, there was water dripping all over the table. Once we figured that out and it was nicely cleaned off, our food arrived and we thought we were going to get down to business. The problem, however, was that the plates were so large and the table was so small that they didn't fit on the table. When I asked the waiter what we should do about it, he suggested that we put some of it on the floor till we needed it. Honestly. Worse than that, the food itself was rather disappointing, won't tell you why, and the music was so loud we could hardly talk. I mean, it was an evening designed in that other place. Definitely not heaven, and we knew it. And on the way home, in total disgust, we started listing all the things that had gone wrong at the restaurant, and we couldn't name them all. There were so many. It was a disaster, in other words. And as we named each one and described them to each other, something surprising happened. We suddenly started laughing, realizing the craziness of the evening for one thing, but also just having fun, thinking about the moment, and sharing it with one another. It was a hoot. But it was also a revelation, because in that moment, I realized why it was that we really went out to eat that night. And it wasn't just for the food, though we were certainly looking forward to that. Mistakenly, it turns out. It was really an opportunity to be together, to talk, to share, to enjoy together the things that we had experienced that day without the other. But that didn't happen until that moment in the car on the way home. Why? Well, the music was too loud for one thing, or that was our excuse. But in fact, what happened is that we let the lesser thing directly in front of us obscure the greater joy that we were there for. Food is good, by the way. It's a gift, which everyone doesn't have in such abundance and for which we should not only be grateful, but generous. That's a point of praying before the meal, in my opinion. But food has a higher purpose, it turns out. It brings us together. It allows us to connect with others, to share, to learn, to enjoy the wonder of the fellowship that we have with one another and with the giver, by the way. And of course, Jesus drove this point home at the Last Supper when he told his disciples to eat together and remember him. Take this bread and remember. Take this wine and remember. That's the point of the Eucharist, or communion, of course. But I would contend that's the point of everything. Everything he gives us all the time, every day. And if we don't remember, if we don't enjoy, appreciate, wonder, and go awe once in a while, then we're stupid, ignorant, in the words of the psalmist, and just plain dumb, in the words that I grew up with. That doesn't make it easy, by the way. Easy and dumb are two different things. Right now, a good friend of ours in California is battling a very serious case of cancer. She's a professor of computer science, and her husband is a physics prof. We've known them for quite a while, but got especially close during those days when we were working together. Two things come to mind whenever I think of them. First is laughter, since both of them love to laugh, and her husband tells the worst jokes in the world. The second is tears, since she's much too young to be dealing with this. I won't tell you all the details, but there's no question from one perspective that this whole thing is immensely unfair. She almost missed the wedding of their son because she was so weak. These should be some of the greatest days in their lives as they watch their children flourish, their students flourish, as they see the fruit, in other words, of all they've done over the years. And then right in the middle of this comes this cancer, this very serious cancer, I should say. And it's awful. And yet, and this is why I'm telling you this, I've never seen two people appreciate life and the giver of life as much as these people right now. Every email that we get from them is a thank you. Every time they tell us about the bad news, we get 10 times more good news. And why is that? Well, perhaps personality has something to do with it. They are smilers in a way and have been as long as we've known them. But that doesn't really explain things if you want to know the truth, because the question is, why do they smile? If you talk to both of them and trace their lives from day one, you discover they've had a lot of hard times, many disappointments, many reasons not to smile, you might say. But they do, and they have, and they are right now in the most difficult of circumstances. Why? Well, they're redeemers at heart, having had lots of hard times before, but always giving them to the Lord and watching Him redeem one difficult situation after another. They are people of deep faith, in other words, a faith that's been tested through the worst of times and come out stronger every time. They're not stupid, in other words, like me. I don't mean that in terms of brains, by the way, although they're both Stanford grads who've been at the top of their class forever, so that's true, come to think of it. But they're bright in another way as well, a much, much more important way. They know every day is a gift from God, and they live that way. When teaching, they live that way. When eating, they live that way. When doing research or mowing the lawn or just walking through campus, they live that way. And now when facing the most difficult thing that either of them can imagine, they're living that way. You know, some people say when they encounter folks that live grateful lives that it's just because they're lucky, have so much to be thankful for, or have some strange personality that allows them to be grateful even when they shouldn't. And honestly, the older I get, the more I want to just slap such folks across the face. It's so wrong. Friends, it isn't the spoiled kids who appreciate each day. It's the ones who are not. They know the value of what they've been given, and they live that way. Have you read the story of the feeding of the 5,000 recently? You know, the one where Jesus takes a few loaves and fishes and winds up feeding the whole crowd? Of course you do. It's one of the more amazing stories in the Bible. But do you remember what happened after that story? Well, the people were absolutely amazed. In fact, they wanted to make Jesus king right then and there. But Jesus retreats, so they can't make him king, and so they can't do what they wanted. And then he walks on water and tells them about an even more important kind of bread than the one they ate. That would be him, Jesus, who is the bread of life. And then the people start arguing about what he meant. And in just a few days, almost all of his followers have left him. And he's standing there alone with just the 12 who don't have anywhere else to go. And it's amazing and totally crazy. And it's the story of our lives. We are fed daily from the hand of God. We see one miracle after another in creation, in the classroom, in our friends, in our lives. And instead of learning something from it, we just want more. How stupid are we? How stupid am I? My mind returns to that trip to Israel and the morning of our last full day in Jerusalem. At the moment, we were getting ready to head downstairs to breakfast one more time. But since I was already dressed and ready to go, and my wife was not, surprise, surprise, I walked over to the window and did something I had done repeatedly since we arrived. I just stared out the window and tried to comprehend what it was we were seeing. That happened, by the way, from the first moment we arrived in Jerusalem. Since we were on a hill, we had a wonderful view of the town, the old city right below us, and the Mount of Olives out in the distance, and then about 100 other places that I had heard about or was learning about. And so I would try to figure things out, looking at the map and then looking back out the window, basically just trying to get a handle intellectually on what was out there. But then something changed as I continued looking out the window. And it happened gradually at first, but it really hit me that morning as we were heading down to breakfast for the last time, our last day in Jerusalem. You know what it was? It was finally another awe moment, finally. Because what I was seeing out the window right before my eyes was amazing. Some of it, by the way, related to the various buildings, the churches, towers, and extraordinary walls and artifacts that had been built there over the years. But most of it was not. It was not built by human hands, but the hands of God. The hills themselves, which I loved the moment we arrived, but also the groves of trees, tended by God's creatures to be sure, but distributed in different sections of the city, and contrasting so amazingly with the white rock and the blue sky. It was a scene that David had looked at, I realized, and the son of David, and 100 other characters in the Bible. And I was at that moment sharing something with these people that I loved. I thought of David looking out at the same scene, considering the hills and probably smiling, thinking of the gift that he'd been given and absolutely didn't deserve. I thought of Jesus, probably crying, saying those words recorded by Luke, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings." We think of those words as a critique, of course, which they were, but forget about the love that inspired them, a love he compares with a mother caring for her flock. God loves us. That is why he gave us Jerusalem in the first place. That is why he gives us everything we have, wherever we find it. And our job is to say thank you, to genuinely appreciate it, to faithfully steward it, to lovingly enjoy it, and to share it with one another as it was shared with us. In the case of Jerusalem, as you know, we didn't do that, which is why Jesus was crying. And we don't do that to this very day, in spite of what Jesus did on Calvary in Jerusalem to make it possible. Oh, we appreciate some of God's gifts for about 10 seconds, and then we see what we can do to hang on to them or hoard them or consume them as quickly as possible before someone else takes them away from us. But this time, I couldn't do that. We were leaving. I was seeing what I was seeing wasn't mine. I couldn't keep it. It was instead, finally, what it really was, a gift, pure and simple. All I could do was look at it, appreciate it, and remember what I had been given. I pray to God that I will never forget.